March 7, 1945. 31,000 feet above the industrial sprawl of Tokyo, where winter cold turned breath to ice and thin air starved engines of precious oxygen. Second Lieutenant James R. Hargrove from Iowa, 22 years old, son of a corn farmer who had never seen the ocean before enlisting, banked his P-51 Mustang into a shallow turn and felt the aircraft respond with the precision of a fine instrument. Below him, through gaps in the cloud cover, the factories and rail yards of the Japanese capital stretched toward horizons obscured by industrial haze and distance. He had been detached from his bomber escort group to investigate reported fighter activity to the north. Standard procedure, routine reconnaissance. But the radio chatter filling his headset was anything but routine. Japanese voices, urgent and overlapping, speaking in the clipped cadences of pilots coordinating an intercept. Hargrove understood perhaps one word in 10, but he understood the tone perfectly. They had found him, and they were coming. 12 contacts. The number came through clearly in the Japanese transmissions, confirmed moments later by Hargrove's own visual identification as the enemy fighters climbed toward his altitude from multiple vectors. 12 Kawasaki Ki-61 Heians, called Tony by Allied intelligence, sleek, fast, dangerous aircraft flown by pilots defending their homeland. The mathematics were brutal and simple. One American fighter against 12 Japanese interceptors. The Tony was an excellent aircraft at altitude, nearly as fast as the Mustang in level flight, more maneuverable in turning combat. Japanese doctrine emphasized swarming tactics, using numerical superiority to box in and overwhelm individual opponents. Standard procedure for an outnumbered pilot was clear: run, break contact. Dive for lower altitude where the Mustang's performance advantages became overwhelming, then head for home at maximum speed. Hargrove did not run, not yet. He pushed the throttle forward, felt the Merlin engine respond with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat, and pointed the Mustang's nose toward the nearest enemy fighters. The farm boy from Iowa, who had learned to fly in a Stearman biplane over cornfields that stretched to flat horizons, was about to teach 12 Japanese interceptors a lesson in pure speed. By March of 1945, the air war over Japan had entered its final, desperate phase. American B-29 superfortresses flew from bases in the Mariana Islands, bombing Japanese cities with increasing frequency and devastating effect. Long-range P-51 Mustangs, operating from Iwo Jima after its capture in February, now escorted these bomber streams, engaging Japanese interceptors over their own homeland. For the Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Service, this represented the ultimate humiliation. Enemy fighters operating freely in Japanese airspace, their presence a daily reminder that the technological and industrial advantages Japan had possessed in 1941 had evaporated like morning fog under the sun of American production. The pilots who flew those defensive missions were a mixture of surviving veterans, men who had fought in China and the Philippines and the South Pacific, and hastily trained replacements whose flight hours before combat assignment sometimes numbered in the dozens rather than hundreds. They flew aircraft that were often excellent designs. The Ki-61 was comparable to contemporary American fighters in many respects, but they operated under crippling disadvantages. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement parts were scarce. Most critically, they faced an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited numbers of aircraft, unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, and pilots who arrived fresh and well-trained every month in quantities that defied comprehension. The Japanese pilots who climbed toward Hargrove that morning expected what they had been trained to expect: an American fighter that would see itself outnumbered and retreat, attempting to escape through speed and dive performance. Their doctrine prescribed coordinated pursuit, maintaining formation integrity, using radio communication to box in the enemy, and force him into a position where numerical superiority could be brought to bear. The squadron leader, a veteran with 41 confirmed kills dating back to operations in China in 1939, issued crisp commands over the radio. 4 fighters would approach from ahead, forcing the American to turn. 4 would position themselves on the flanks, ready to cut off lateral escape. 4 would climb to altitude advantage, prepared to dive on the enemy if he attempted to climb away. It was textbook interception, executed by pilots who understood formation tactics and had practiced these maneuvers countless times. What they did not expect was for the American to accelerate toward them. The P-51D Mustang that Hargrove flew that morning represented the apex of American fighter design. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine, producing over 1,700 horsepower, capable of speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour, equipped with a range that allowed it to escort bombers from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back, the Mustang was more than an excellent aircraft. It was a statement of industrial philosophy. Every component had been designed for mass production. Simplified manufacturing techniques allowed factories to produce Mustangs at rates that seemed impossible to enemies still building fighters with hand-fitted parts and traditional construction methods. The result was an aircraft that was both technically superior and numerically overwhelming, the perfect weapon of a democracy that had chosen total mobilization over limited war. But the aircraft was merely hardware. What made it lethal was the pilot and the training system that had produced him. Hargrove had logged over 400 hours of flight time before arriving in theater, including extensive instrument training, gunnery practice, formation flying, and tactical instruction. He had been taught to think independently, to recognize and exploit opportunities, to understand his aircraft's performance envelope and push it to the limits when necessary. Most importantly, he had been taught that speed was life, that altitude was energy, and that a fast-moving target was nearly impossible to hit. These lessons, absorbed through hundreds of hours of training that consumed vast quantities of fuel that America could afford and Japan could not, would keep him alive in the next 15 minutes. The Japanese formation began its coordinated approach. The four lead fighters turned to intercept, expecting Hargrove to bank away or dive. Instead, the Mustang maintained heading and increased speed, closing the distance at a combined rate of over 900 miles per hour. Hargrove's thumb rested on the gun button, but he did not fire. He was not trying to shoot down the lead fighters. He was trying to disrupt their coordination, to force them to react defensively, to make them flinch. At a closing rate that allowed perhaps 2 seconds of firing opportunity, the lead Japanese pilots did flinch. They broke formation, banking hard to avoid a head-on collision with an enemy fighter that seemed determined to ram them or die trying. In those 2 seconds, the carefully coordinated interception plan disintegrated. The Japanese radio frequencies erupted in confusion. The squadron leader barked orders trying to reassert control, but the geometry of the engagement had changed. Hargrove had blown through the forward element of the trap at 440 miles per hour, and now the four fighters that should have forced him to turn were behind him, scrambling to reverse course and pursue. The flank fighters, positioned to cut off lateral escape, found themselves out of position as the Americans streaked past their intercept point. The high fighters began their dive, but Hargrove saw them coming and pushed the Mustang into a shallow climb, trading speed for altitude in a perfectly calculated maneuver that kept him just ahead of their attack angle. The squadron leader's voice cut through the radio chatter, sharp with frustration. He ordered his pilots to pursue, to maintain formation, to use their numerical advantage. But maintaining formation required coordination, and coordination required communication, and communication was becoming increasingly difficult as 12 fighters scattered across miles of sky tried to chase one target that refused to slow down. The Japanese pilots found themselves in a pursuit race against an opponent who seemed to have no intention of engaging in combat. Hargrove was not dogfighting. He was running, but running on his terms, at his speed, in the direction of his choosing. The symbolic object that defined this engagement was not a weapon but a gauge, the airspeed indicator. Throughout the chase, Hargrove's eyes returned to that instrument again and again. It showed him the edge he possessed, the margin of survival measured in miles per hour. When the Japanese fighters approached maximum speed in their pursuit, the Mustang was still accelerating. When they reached the limit of their high-altitude performance, Hargrove still had throttle to spare. The airspeed indicator represented everything that separated American and Japanese aviation by 1945. Superior engine design, better fuel, more advanced metallurgy, the accumulated advantages of an industrial base that could afford to over-engineer every component. Every time Hargrove glanced at that gauge and saw the needle climbing past 420, past 430, past 440 miles per hour, he was reading the obituary of Japanese air power, written in instrument readings and engine RPM. For 8 minutes, the chase continued. The Japanese fighters strained their engines to maximum output, but they could not close the distance. Several pilots reported mechanical problems, engines overheating, oil pressure dropping, as they pushed their aircraft beyond sustainable limits in a futile attempt to catch the American. The squadron leader made the tactical decision to split his formation, sending 6 fighters to try to cut off Hargrove's escape route, while the other 6 maintained direct pursuit. It was a reasonable tactic that might have worked against a slower opponent. Against Hargrove, it simply meant that 12 fighters became 2 groups of 6, neither of which could coordinate effectively with the other. The Japanese radio transmissions, intercepted and translated by American intelligence after the war, captured the growing desperation. "Increase speed! He is pulling away!" And then, repeated by multiple pilots, the phrase that would give this engagement its name: "Too fast! Too fast!" The words carried more than tactical frustration. They carried the recognition that this was not a fight that could be won through courage or skill or determination. The American fighter was simply faster, and in aerial combat, speed conferred a form of invulnerability that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. At 14 minutes into the engagement, Hargrove made his final move. He had been gradually turning south toward Iwo Jima and safety, but the Japanese fighters still pursued, refusing to break off despite fuel consumption that must have been reaching critical levels. Hargrove checked his own fuel, adequate for another hour of flight at cruise speed, or 30 minutes at maximum power. He had enough. The Japanese, he calculated, probably did not. He pushed the throttle to the firewall, advanced the propeller control to maximum RPM, and the Mustang leaped forward with acceleration that pressed him back into his seat. The airspeed indicator climbed past 450 miles per hour. Behind him, the Japanese fighters fell away, first gradually, then decisively, as the gap widened from hundreds of yards to miles. The squadron leader's final transmission was brief, professional, tinged with bitter acceptance. Break off pursuit. Return to base. 12 fighters turned back toward Tokyo, having burned precious fuel in a chase that achieved nothing except the demonstration of their own obsolescence. Several aircraft landed with tanks nearly empty, the margin for error so thin that one pilot overshot his field and crash-landed in a rice paddy, surviving but writing off his aircraft. The squadron leader filed a report noting that American fighters now possessed performance advantages that made interception increasingly difficult. He recommended against pursuing single fighters that demonstrated superior speed, advising instead to concentrate on bomber interception where numbers could still be decisive. It was the recommendation of a realist who understood that the war in the air was already lost, that all that remained was to delay the inevitable while consuming the last reserves of fuel and aircraft and trained pilots. Hargrove landed at Iwo Jima 70 minutes later with fuel to spare. His after-action report was characteristically terse. Engaged by 12 enemy fighters, maintained speed advantage, disengaged without damage, no ammunition expended. The intelligence officers noted it with interest. Another data point showing that Japanese interceptors were struggling to match the performance of late-model American fighters. But they could not have heard the Japanese radio transmissions, could not have known about the repeated cries of "too fast, too fast," that captured in 3 syllables the entire trajectory of the Pacific Air War's final phase. What the Japanese pilots expected that morning was a combat engagement that would test skill, tactics, and courage. They expected an opportunity to bring their numerical advantage to bear, to execute the coordinated attacks they had practiced, to demonstrate that Japanese pilots defending their homeland could still match any enemy. What they experienced instead was a pursuit race they could not win, against an opponent who possessed advantages that skill and courage could not overcome. The engagement lasted less than 15 minutes, but it crystallized the reality of air combat in 1945. American fighters were not just equal to their Japanese counterparts, they were superior in every measurable way. And that superiority was the product of an industrial and technological system that Japan could not match. The transformation this engagement represented was profound and final. Japanese air doctrine had been built on the assumption that quality could compensate for quantity, that superior training and tactics could overcome numerical disadvantages, that fighting spirit could bridge gaps in technology and logistics. The Battle of Midway had begun to erode those assumptions. The attrition battles of 1943 and 1944 had further damaged them. But encounters like Hargrove's chase above Tokyo shattered them completely. When an enemy fighter could simply outrun 12 interceptors through pure performance advantage, when speed alone conferred near immunity from attack, traditional concepts of air combat became irrelevant. The new reality was arithmetic. America could build faster fighters in greater numbers, flown by better-trained pilots, supported by unlimited fuel and maintenance. Japan could not. Everything else was detail. The farm boy from Iowa, who had never seen combat before arriving in the Pacific Theater in January 1945, who had learned to fly in peaceful Midwestern skies, had demonstrated the essential truth that would define the final months of the war. American industrial democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, had produced a military machine that could not be defeated through courage or determination or tactical brilliance. The P-51 Mustang that carried Hargrove away from 12 pursuing fighters was more than an aircraft. It was a factory system, a supply chain, a training pipeline, a fuel production infrastructure, an entire technological and industrial civilization condensed into aluminum and steel and spinning propeller. The Japanese fighters that pursued him represented centuries of warrior tradition, martial discipline, and tactical sophistication. But tradition could not make engines run faster than their design allowed. Discipline could not manufacture fuel that did not exist. Sophistication could not bridge the gap between industrial systems operating at fundamentally different scales of production and innovation. The airspeed indicator that Hargrove had monitored throughout the chase, that symbolic gauge whose needle climbing past 450 miles per hour had spelled the difference between survival and death, represented more than aircraft performance. It represented the speed of American factory production, the velocity of scientific advancement, the rate at which a mobilized democracy could convert industrial capacity into military power. When that needle showed Hargrove pulling away from his pursuers, it was showing him the accumulated advantages of a system that valued individual initiative, that encouraged innovation, that could afford to over-engineer and overproduce because abundance was policy and waste was acceptable if it led to victory. The Japanese pilots who returned to base that afternoon told their ground crews about the American fighter that could not be caught, that simply outran everything they could throw at it. They spoke with professional frustration rather than panic. But beneath the technical discussions about airspeed and pursuit angles, they understood what this meant. The war in the air was over. What remained was simply the process of acknowledging defeat, a process that would take another 5 months and consume thousands more lives before Japan's surrender in August. But the outcome was already written in airspeed indicators and fuel consumption rates, in the mathematics of industrial production that favored America so overwhelmingly that tactics and courage had become insufficient. Hargrove flew 43 more missions before the war ended. He survived them all, returned to Iowa, took over his father's farm, and rarely spoke about his time in combat. When asked years later about the engagement where 12 Japanese fighters had chased him across the Tokyo sky, he remembered mostly the sound of the Merlin engine at maximum power, the steady, reliable thunder that had carried him away from danger. That sound, he said, had made him feel invincible, not because of any personal courage or skill, but because of absolute confidence in the machine beneath him. The engineers who designed it, the workers who built it, the supply system that maintained it, the training program that taught him to fly it, all of that lived in the engine's roar. And all of it had been more powerful than 12 Japanese fighters flown by brave men in doomed aircraft. In the end, the chase above Tokyo was decided before it began, determined not by the actions of individual pilots on that March morning, but by decisions made in factories and design bureaus and training fields across America, decisions that accumulated into insurmountable advantages measured in horsepower and airspeed and fuel capacity. The Japanese pilots who cried, too fast," into their radios were not merely describing an aircraft's performance. They were pronouncing the epitaph of an empire that had gambled on a short war against an enemy it did not understand. An enemy that would prove capable of building not just more fighters, but faster fighters, better fighters, in numbers that transformed warfare from a contest of skill into a contest of production. And in that contest, there had never been any doubt about the outcome. The farm boy from Iowa, who had outrun 12 interceptors simply by pushing his throttle forward, had proven that truth in the most elemental way possible. By flying faster than his enemies could follow, straight into the future they could no longer prevent.